and welcome to Knitsy Nails. My name is Amy. I've been knitting for about 8 years and crocheting for almost 30. For a lot of people, a new year is a time to learn a new skill. For any of you who may have decided that you want to learn how to start knitting in 2025, here are my top 10 tips for a new knitter. Tip number 1 is that you don't need to get all of the fancy tools right from the start. I know it can be really tempting to splurge on all of the fanciest, highest rated, most expensive equipment right from the beginning, but this can get very spendy very quickly. Make sure that you actually enjoy knitting before you go overboard buying fancy equipment. For an absolute beginner, I would recommend a pair of bamboo circular needles. You can get them at any craft store, and they are quite affordable. Bamboo needles are grippier, meaning that the yarn is less likely to slip off, and you're less likely to drop a stitch. Check what size is recommended in your first patterns, but I would say somewhere between a size 6 and a size 8 is probably going to be useful. I tend to knit quite loosely, so my size 6s get a lot of use, but it's pretty common for new knitters to knit quite tightly, so you may need to go up to a 7 or an 8. I honestly still use my cheap bamboo needles from when I was first knitting all the time. They are very useful. I use them a lot when I'm working with a bamboo or a silk that's very slippery. And personally, I don't feel the need to replace something that I already have. Tip number 2 is to not give in to yarn snobbery. There's a lot of talk online and in local yarn stores about some yarns being inherently better than others, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with using the yarn that is the most affordable and accessible to you. Acrylic yarn is very cheap and available at any big box craft store that you may go to. It's also very easy to rip out when you inevitably make a mistake. You are also much less likely to feel bad about potentially wasting a little bit of a $6 skein of Caron Simply Soft than you would with a $30 skein of hand-dyed wool. Another great option for beginners is cotton. This is also available at any big box store. You can walk into any Joann's and find some Lily Sugar and Cream in any color that might suit your fancy. Cotton is also super useful for things like dishcloths or coasters because it's absorbent. If you want to go the wool route, I would recommend starting with a superwash wool over a non-superwash wool. Superwashing refers to a process that wool goes through to make it able to be put in the washer and dryer instead of needing to be hand washed. Superwash wool often tends to be less scratchy than non-superwash wool, and when you inevitably put your finished object in a washer and dryer instead of hand washing it, you are less likely to end up with a felted, shrunken, unusable mess with superwash wool. I personally know myself well enough to know that if I make a garment that I'm going to have to hand wash, I'm not going to wash it, so it's not going to be wearable. So I use superwash wool for everything. Tip number 3 is to remember that there is no one true way to knit. If you are making stitches and they're not twisted and they're recognizable as stitches, you are knitting. It doesn't matter if you're knitting continental style or English style, Portuguese style, Eastern style, Irish cottage style. If you are creating stitches, you are knitting. Continental is not better than English. Garter stitch is not better than stockinette. Lace shawls are not better than dishcloths. It's okay if you are slow, or if your tension is wonky, or if you have to refer to tutorials every step of the way. If you are creating stitches, you are knitting. Tip number 4 is practice makes perfect. As you continue to make those stitches over and over and over, you'll begin to develop a muscle memory for it. At that point, you'll be able to speed up and tackle more advanced techniques. Don't compare yourself to people online who can whip up a sweater in a week. I've been knitting for nearly a decade and I can't do that. I can barely force myself to finish a sweater in 2 months. This is especially true for us plus-size people, because our stitch counts are higher than people who are making a size small or a size medium. So of course it's going to take longer. We have 300 stitches per row and they have 150. Tip number 5 is to carefully consider your beginner projects. A lot of people will recommend a garter stitch scarf as your first project. This is absolutely a good option, don't get me wrong. It's just knit stitches back and forth with no increases or decreases in a big long rectangle. But a scarf also takes a long time to make. A good scarf is 5, 6, 7 feet long, and it can be really daunting to finish something that is that long of just knit stitches. I would recommend something like a dishcloth or a coaster as a first project. They're still just rectangles or squares, but they're a lot smaller than a full scarf. You're also less likely to mind if that thing that you use to scrub food off of your dishes isn't perfect, but you might not wear a scarf that doesn't look great. Tip number 6 is to try a new technique with every project. Try to challenge yourself and pick up a new technique with each project that you start. So if your first project was in garter stitch, your next could be in stockinette to work on some purls. Then you could try some ribbing or some seed stitch where you're switching between knits and purls within the same row. Then try something with some increases and some decreases. Then different types of increases and decreases. Try something in the round, like a hat. Then try some socks that has some short rows. Of course, if you are not comfortable with each technique, it's totally fine to repeat projects. But don't limit yourself because you don't think that you can grasp a new technique. You are far more capable than you give yourself credit for. There's videos and books for every technique to show you what to do. And it's totally okay if you are not perfect when you are first starting out. Tip number 7 is to work your way up to a big project. Early on, I would recommend browsing Ravelry or Pinterest for something that is inspiring to you. You might already have something that inspired you to start knitting. For me, it was socks. I had been crocheting for 20 some odd years at that point, and I had attempted to crochet socks, but they really just don't work quite as well as knitted socks. They don't have the same elasticity. So I decided I was going to teach myself how to knit so that I could make myself hand knit socks. And I did. Find that one piece that you desperately want to knit and download the pattern, even before you've touched any knitting needles or yarn. Download the pattern, look through it for the techniques it uses, and then focus your practice on those techniques. Most patterns will have a stitch glossary right at the beginning. So, for example, if you are seeing some of these gorgeous colorwork sweaters all over the internet, a halibut sweater or the porcelain sweater, you can go and look at the pattern and you can tell yourself, okay, so I'll need to learn how to do ribbing for the neck and cuffs. I'll have to learn some short row shaping. I'll have to learn how to size up to a different needle for the colorwork sections, as well as how to work colorwork. You might have to learn a fancy cast on or bind off technique. So go ahead and practice those. If you want to make that colorwork sweater, try on a colorwork hat first. It will still have some increases and decreases. It'll still be worked in the round. It'll still probably have some ribbing at the brim, and it will give you a chance to figure out how to do color work without being bogged down by an entire sweater. Once you have a grasp on the techniques and you feel ready, dive on in. Buy the yarn that makes your heart sing, get the cute stitch markers, and do the damn thing. Tip number 8 is to learn how to put in a lifeline. A lifeline is a piece of scrap yarn or thread that's worked into the stitches that are on your needle and remains there as you move forward. If you make a mistake after that point, you can take out your needles and rip the project back to that lifeline, but because the lifeline is there, you'll be able to stop at that point without dropping any stitches and without having to start over all the way from the beginning. Don't be afraid to put in as many lifelines as you might need. You can pull them out when you're done and reuse that scrap for a smaller project or for future lifelines. When I was first learning to make socks, I was knitting them cuff down, and I would put in a lifeline once I finished my cuff ribbing, about halfway through the leg, right before I started the heel, and right after I finished the heel. I would put one in about halfway through the foot, and then right before I started my toe decreases. There is no shame in putting in as many lifelines as you may possibly need. Tip number 9 is to learn how to read your knitting. Reading your knitting refers to looking at the stitches that you've already made and determining what they are just by sight. For example, in a pattern with just knits and purls, like some seed stitch, you will see knits look like little V's and purls look like little bumps. If, like in seed stitch, your pattern says to knit the purls and purl the knits, you will know that means that when you see a little bump, you'll need to make a knit stitch, and when you see a little V, you'll need to make a purl stitch. This is also super useful for when you put a project down and then pick it back up. It might be hard to figure out where you were in your pattern if you are not super diligent about keeping track of this. Reading your knitting will allow you to see what stitches you just made in your last row and cross-reference that with your pattern. And tip number 10 is don't give up. An unfortunate side effect of being a human is that we make mistakes. This is especially true when we are learning new skills. Don't get discouraged if you're having trouble. Keep at it, and eventually it will click. You can keep referencing the tutorial videos or books that you were reading. And if you're having trouble with one style, try something else. If you're having trouble with continental, try English style. If you're having trouble working purls, try working just some plain garter or stockinette for a while to really force yourself to learn. Do not be worried if you are not perfect right from the get-go. No one is. If you are a new knitter and you found these tips helpful, please consider giving me a like. If you're an experienced knitter and you have other tips that you think would be useful for our new knitting friends, please leave a comment down below and let us know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.